Yet?
No, but we'll just start a little early. Okay, here we go.
Does it matter? Okay.
1, it doesn't matter. No, the stars are matter, we are matter, but it doesn't matter, as Captain Beefheart said so beautifully in a poem. My name is Jerry Fialka, and welcome to the Global Theater. It is December 23, 2022. We want to thank Rob Grant and his amazing podcast, I'm Probably Wrong About Everything. It's truly an honor and a pleasure to be here with Louis Klahr. Is that the correct way to pronounce that last name, Louis?
Yeah, and
wow.
it's a tough one, Jerry, so I'm impressed.
Thank you. First question is, what is the best thing for a human being?
The best thing for a human being? Well, that's such a huge question. Really it is to have enough security in every way, in terms of where one lives, what one eats, how one proceeds through life. I think that's one of the most important things. And I think the stability of those really leads to being able to make art,
Yeah, that's good. What's your favorite form of information, how it comes into you?
Oh, I'm not really big on favorites.
Or just, what's a form of it? Yeah, because I appreciate this because it's like me and you versus the wording on the questions. So, it's adaptability. Because some of my questions are, is it more this or more that? And a woman recently said, the word more doesn't function in your question. So I'm just sort of giving out prompts, and you don't have to answer the question as they usually say. But it would be like rephrasing. It would be, what's a form of information that has a lot of impact on you that you constantly turn to or gravitate towards?
Well, there's several, I mean, there's, movies and television, especially classic Hollywood's very important to me. Besides, when I was formative, experimental film functioned like that. It functions less that way now. Reading, especially, all kinds of things, fiction and biographies, and the newspaper daily.
Yeah.
And then there's music, which I've always been, since I've been about 10 years old, I've been an explorer and need to find new things I'm excited about, whether those are older or newer,
Yeah, that was good survey. And just on reading for a second as a divert, did you become a reader because, one, your parents told you to read, they did it as an example, or on your own?
No, it's really more my parents read, but, and the school system I went to certainly stressed it, but it's more the times I grew up in where there was an understanding, like coming of age in the 1970s, there was an understanding that reading was a way to inform yourself about the world. And that if you weren't doing that, you would be deficient in some kind of way.
Yeah. It's funny. Harold Bloom says, I was born in 1953. He said, you kids were not reading. You were listening to rock lyrics. Yeah. You were listening to lyrics instead of reading. So I'm a idiot. I'd never read. Yeah. Even though I run a Finnegan's Wake reading club, it doesn't matter. I'm not literate. But
I'm sure Mr. Bloom would approve of that.
Oh yeah.
You're running that group.
Yes. Oh yeah. He loves the way he loves Joyce. But why do you think humans collect or gather information?
I guess it's it's helped us like develop all kinds of things, technology, et cetera, and more advancement, which there, as messed up as the world is today, there's I forget the social critic historian who said this, but there's a guy who goes around and he talks about how things have also never been better, in terms of the overall living standard, the amount of people alive, like the planet, is definitely overpopulated for how it's organized, especially in my mind in terms of capitalism. But at the same time, you wouldn't have that many people if things weren't going well on one level to be able to be supported, So it's there's a lot of paradoxes to all these things. So
very good. That's what we're exploring, paradoxes. And again, it's more your hunch and your guess and intuition on some of these questions. Is this need or want to collect information more innate or more invented?
Well, I'm going to pass on that one in this sense, but I'll answer it in this sense. For me, in the experience I have, so I live in a first world urban culture and always have. And within that kind of milieu, information is essential. Whether it's about entertainment, sports, current events, in terms of interfacing with other people and making decisions about different things. So it's part of the warp and woof of everyday existence for me, and a lot of my art has dealt with the notion of the way, because I'm dealing with collage, I'm dealing with a lot of outmoded materials. And those have taken me into the past in different respects. And so part of my exploration has been of the pastness of the present is the term that I've come up with to explain it. Because the past is always being reinterpreted by the present.
Yeah, this is cosmic too, Lewis, because Wyndham Lewis said artists live in the present and write a detailed history of the future. And I like your art, and I think that's what you're doing. You're living in the present. Like Martha Graham said, great artists are their times. They're not ahead of their times. And you're living in the present. You're writing a detailed history of the future. So thank you. You really get it, Lewis. I appreciate your time. Do thoughts create emotions?
Yeah, I think things are inseparable, actually, that way.
Yeah. I don't know what. Oh, go ahead.
So, these things, these experiences, these phenomena, they interpenetrate. It's hard to isolate them.
Yeah.
I'm not an artist that's afraid of emotion. I work the way I do partly because I thought having emotion in my work was important. Whereas there's other artists I've met who want a kind of more distance, but distance is an emotion too. So yeah. I don't think it's a question of like degree on all these things. So
yeah, because this is again a funny question. It's unanswerable, but I'll ask it anyways because I ask it at every question at every interview. Are your observations of humans in general, are we more feeling beings or more thinking beings?
I'm not sure. Often when I'm looking at the political culture of this country, especially, the last, like 2016 to 2020, I had a lot of questions about how people are, whether they're thinking more emotionally or sort of thoughtfully, but it's kind of more objectively. So, but those things ebb and flow,
Yep.
and again, I don't come down on one side or the other.
Yeah. I don't think we can separate.
I don't think it's possible. I don't think
Yeah.
it's an either or situation. I think both function at different times. So.
See, we humans invented the words thinking and feeling. So we think we can say, because honestly, 80% of people I ask that question, they go, well, we're more feeling beings. But it's like connected and we can't separate it, but we think we can because we invented the words. So Lewis, fill in the blank. I don't know what I think until
Well, I'd have to know what I'm supposed to be thinking about to answer that one.
Well, that's good. It would be, I don't know what I think until I know what I'm thinking about.
Yeah, that's an answer. Yeah.
Yeah. Because McLuhan says, I don't know what I think until I say it. And Joan Didion says, I don't know what I think until I write it. So I'm getting a lot of this recently until I do it.
Well, in terms of my own art making, it's kind of a combination. There's intent, and then there's also discovery and improvisation. My work tends to come out better when the balance is more towards intuition, improvisation, spontaneity. When I overthink something, it's usually pretty dead what I make, so.
I agree. And we're going to get into a few more philosophical, just background questions. Can humans think without language?
Yeah. But it depends on what kind of language you're talking about. Like, I'm assuming I'm making an assumption there, which is, I think, false on my part. I made an assumption there answering that language is written. You're talking about words or spoken, but it's not. It can be all kinds of other things, visually, musically. There's all kinds of languages. So it's I don't know. It's another one of those things that, I find for me, I don't think as philosophically as I think you do, Jerry.
Oh no, I'm just a normal Joe, man. I'm just saying these questions to get us to jump off into this talking mode. I think conversation is where it's at, in my opinion. So it doesn't
matter. I enjoy a good conversation too, but I don't.
But Chomsky says a language is. Yeah, Chomsky says a language is not just words. It's a culture, a tradition, a unification of community, a whole history that creates what a community is. What do you do, Lewis? What do you do when language doesn't work, when language breaks down?
Depends on the context.
Yeah, again, you put it in the context you want. You're talking to your wife or you're at the store and language breaks down.
It depends on how much I have to keep relating with that person, Yeah. So like if it's a student, that's one set of values and responsibilities. If it's my wife, that's another.
Yeah.
If it's a stranger that I'm having a interaction with over a disagreement about how we both drive our cars, well, you try to, if there's no impact, you try to get away from situations like that as quickly as possible.
There you go. That answers the question. So these are two questions from Alan Turing in 1950s. Is thinking a function of the soul?
I don't even know what the soul is. Whenever everybody uses that word, and I've never explored a definition of it. That
Yeah,
I can't answer that one at all.
that's all right. And don't feel obliged. You know, Rebecca Solnit says it so well. Just because you ask a question doesn't mean I have to answer it. And I'm all for that. You know, I'm not trying to put you on the spot saying, you know, this is yeah.
I'm a film artist. What
Yeah.
do I know about anything?
You know a lot, dude. I know. I've seen you speak publicly and I've listened to you and read your interviews. You know a lot. Okay, the second Turing
That's
question.
kind of you, and thank you, but I disagree.
Okay. Well, that's the most important thing in my life is to find people who civilly disagree.
Yeah.
Okay, the second Turing question is, can machines think?
I guess by certain definitions of thinking, they probably can. And they're becoming more that way as they develop further. You know,
Yeah.
I am intrigued by these sort of sci-fi, but also speculative ideas about machines being like the next kind of life form in a way.
Yeah.
To take over. That makes sense to me on some level, you know.
Yeah. Do you more pursue happiness or more pursue meaning?
I think by pursuing meaning, I'm pursuing happiness. So they're not separate.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Does the brain more detect consciousness or create consciousness? Like, is consciousness there bubbling away and we're detecting it, or are we creating it?
I think people's consciousness, there's like a range. And people are kind of unique and kind of not. But generally, everybody's kind of, you know, in my experience, people are wired rather specifically for themselves. And they have different capacities and different strengths and different abilities from that and different emphases. So that, yeah, I think that's as much as I have to say on that.
Cool. Audre Lorde, the poet, said, "You can't dismantle the master's house using the master's tools." Yvonne Rainer responded and said, "You can if you expose the tools." What new tool do you suggest?
That's a tough one.
And it doesn't have to be new. What tool do you gravitate towards?
Thank you for that adjustment. You know, just being an artist, one of the things I'm trying to do is make people aware of things that maybe they're not so aware of, you know, as well as find commonality.
Yeah.
But, you know, underpinning that question is taking things apart, is that they require massive kind of change. And I find a lot of that stuff overwhelming. And often what happens in revolutions, which is very disappointing, is the people in power change, but the base, like, so they just kind of become what they are replacing very often. So I guess I don't agree with either one of them about this, that you quote the people that you quoted.
Yeah.
On some level, you know, like Russia is this wonderful example of this. So they have czars, Then when the communists take over, there seems to be some kind of opening up. And then by the time of Stalin, he's basically another czar. And then they get democracy when the Soviet Union breaks down or some form of it. And now they've got Putin, who's another czar. And it just keeps replicating itself, And, this is I have a very, just observational, but superficial understanding of Russia and these kinds of trends. But it strikes me that this is what happens in a lot of places,
Yeah.
So it's
got to be
pretty disappointing. But then there's other people who change things in other kinds of ways, that are more long lasting, or one hopes anyway.
And the Russians showed your films. I was like, wow, that's cool.
There's been different things over the years because Russia's a huge place, and it's always been a cultural, an exciting cultural place that's produced all kinds of world famous artists, right, of different kinds. So it's like, there's people there interested. There's people all over the world interested in these kinds of things. This small stuff that I'm part of. It's a very specific language, and has a small following, but it does sort of get around in different shapes, and that's nice. That part of things.
What do you worry about when you go to bed at night?
All kinds of things. Being Jewish, I am extremely anxious. I'm a very anxious person. So all kinds of things, whether it's my own life, my own career, the world, how dangerous it feels like it's becoming, whether it feels like, it's ending in terms of the environmental crisis we've been in throughout my lifetime. And that just feels like it's hitting its peak now in the next 50 years, so I worry about my son's, what his life is going to be like in the midst of that.
Yeah.
If I can find something to worry about, I will.
There you go.
Kind of a natural state of being for me.
Yeah.
Whether I should be worried about it or not.
Well, Marshall McLuhan learned from a poet that artists are the antenna of the race. You already touched on this a little. This sort of radar system. They broadcast and detect the hidden psychic effects of our inventions, so we might be able to learn how to cope with what we don't like about the inventions. So I ask you, Louis, the question Marshall probed his whole career. Why do we ignore the hidden psychic effects of our invention, even though the artists are broadcasting them to us?
Why do things get ignored? People have have to spend a lot of time just surviving, and they have only room for so much information. I think also most people. Artists tend to broadcast things sometimes clearly, but often in a lot of different directions that are not so easy to. There's another description of being an artist that I got from Gregory Bateson that I quite like, where he describes one of the important functions that artists have as being kind of, let me see if I can figure out how to explain this to you. But he was talking about why it was important to like paint foliage well in different paintings. Why that's important for a painter, and there was something about asserting the whole of existence in that artists also kind of reaffirm for people in different ways besides just being antennas.
Yeah.
But getting to your question about being antennas, I've actually, feel like I've experienced this in terms of collage, in terms of my lifetime, that where I got interested in it, it was in late 70s, early 80s, New York. And what was exciting, it felt very exciting to me for a lot of different reasons. But what it allowed, what it sort of predicted that actually came to pass is that all these artists were doing tremendous amount of collage, maybe more so than at any point previously as a form of expression. And then these technology invented all these forms like the internet and computers that kind of took collage operations as part of the way that they functioned. Yeah. So these kinds of investigations of media that a lot of people I knew that were doing in experimental film with found footage, et cetera, these got taken up in this large scale by the technology. So I saw, I actually saw the way that artists were ahead of the curve on that. And then it became more of a mass event in that instance. I personally had a funny experience this way where I used to make, when I was right out of college, so I was shooting in the world with a Super 8 camera. And one of the things I would do is spend like a month or two shooting one roll of film, editing it in the camera, right? And I had different rules about how I approached this. Like each frame had to be different, and some of them it was just I could shoot some repeats, etc. And I would kind of make these. I thought of these as diary films. And a few years ago, I saw there was this app that was invented, and it basically took everybody's still photographs from their phones, and organized them into moving images, and it was kind of like these single frame films I was making that compressed time in this kind of way. So that was a very specific one where what I was involved with, some form of that, not that I influenced this, not that anybody was aware of what I had made on Super 8, but that I had done something from that impulse that then manifested as an app, right? That, I was jealous of the people who made the app because they probably were making a lot of money, whereas, I didn't make any money from my little films,
Well, I think it's beautiful because I ran the Super 8 Film Festival in Ann Arbor, as sort of the junior fest to the 16 Fest, and was like, you've been in Ann Arbor, 60 years it's been going. We were even more ballsy than the 16, or we were looking for stuff that was more ballsy, blah, blah, blah. But I love that, what you just said. It was a beautiful example. And I'm going to look up that Bateson because I actually quote Bateson in an upcoming question, but I love him. Gregory Bateson.
I'll if I can't think of the name of the book, which I probably can't. I think it's called Ecology of Mind.
Ecology of Mind. Yeah, of course. Yeah, no, I'll look it up. But it's funny because it almost goes along with that. What I always say, I think it's Cezanne, it might be Matisse. He says, when you paint your painting and you put it in the bushes, if it blends in, it's a good painting.
That's a good one. I never heard that one.
And so, yeah, do artists have moral obligation?
Do they have moral obligation? I'm not sure they do. But once they put out what they what that viewpoint might be, that might be disagreeing with prevailing morality or arguing with it or whatever, or just be putting out some kind of hateful morality, they have to live with the consequences of that. Yep. And deal with what it does, and what it provokes. When I was working in Hollywood briefly as a screenwriter, I ended up on this project with Mel Gibson's company briefly. Working with people I disagreed with.
Yeah.
And producer on that, and they were making the Jesus film at that time.
Yeah.
While my partner and I were writing an adaptation of a Bill O'Reilly, the Fox News, personality.
Yeah.
Like a novel that he wrote. We were hired to do that. And so, when we weren't talking about what we were commissioned to write, different things would come up, and we'd had meetings at different times. And so later in that process, I think the Jesus film had already been shot at that point, was being edited, and the producer sort of said to me, well, you're Jewish. Like, what do you think about this, that, and the other thing, and I'm not sure I expressed this well, because I kind of wasn't talking that well that day. But my thinking about it was, well, Mel Gibson can make what he wants in terms of this, but he's gonna, if there's hateful anti-Semitic things in it, he's also going to have to answer for those at a certain point, So I wasn't in favor of shutting him down in advance, right?
Yeah.
But it's not like you get to walk free just because you're saying it because you're an artist, or that it can't be argued with or disputed or analyzed or and so, I never saw the completed film, so I don't really have an opinion about what he did that I can talk about with any authority. There's things that I read that sounded disappointing. Yeah. But in general, I'm not in favor of these kinds of shutting things down in advance, that the discussion needs to happen around them at times, so anyway.
I agree with you. That's good. I agree with you. Can you conjure up your earliest memory ever, one of them?
I'm not sure what my earliest memories are. I have several, actually, from when I'm around 3. Because actually from when I'm 2, but almost 3. my birthday's in the end of January. And so when I turned 3, my family had moved to Great Neck, Long Island from where we'd been living in Manhattan, in New York City, from this housing development named Stuyvesant Town. So I have a lot of memories of Stuyvesant Town. And especially, I think, that kind of Christmas season. So now one of the most vivid memories was my older sister taking me next door in Stuyvesant Town from our apartment and holding my hand and walking me into a neighbor's apartment, and they had a Christmas tree. And this is the first time that I was seeing a Christmas tree in somebody's house, I guess,
Yeah.
and that I remember. And it was, just an ecstatic, sublime experience of walking in there. And generally when I remember, as people remember in different ways. Some people remember with moving imagery. I always just remember with like sort of still shots, but I do have a memory of like the first time I remembered this event, of seeing it in motion, like the walk and but the thing with memories that I found out over the years and read about is, as you remember them more, you're remembering the memory of them. And so they start to kind of, deconstruct on you in different ways. I've also found, because I've spent a lot of time kind of tracking memory in different ways, just how bad it is actually. People think I have a good memory because I'm mucking around in the past and I remember things anecdotally. And it's like, I really don't. I've just had a lot of emphasis that I've wanted to place on memory. I was kind of wired that way from a very early age. I remember sitting with my two best friends at in my friend Joey's kitchen. And we sat around his kitchen table, and we were about 10 years old. And we talked about all the toys we used to have. We were having this conversation, which was very stimulating to us. And and his mother, Joey's mother, came bursting in and said, what are you guys doing? You sound like old men. And she was very judgmental, about this. And I think to some degree I came away, from that. And there's a lot of things culturally that actually support, you remembering things, and that was good. And then also kind of judge it as bad. And that sort of gave me this feeling like what I was engaged in was bad. And I was wired that way to like emphasize memory in different ways. So, which exacerbated when I was a very unhappy 15 and 16-year-old, 16-year-old really, and kind of went through a period where I kind of wanted to be 10 years old again when I was really happy, so.
Wow. Well, Louis, tell me someone within your immediate family, then outside your immediate family, just briefly, who had an impact on you, kind of like a role model, and what specifically was that impact?
Well, my older brother was like my hero for a long time, and he was very adventurous in different ways. Like he went off to college in the fall of 1965, when I was in 4th grade. And he came back. He got off the plane at Thanksgiving, and he had hair down to here, which was quite long at the moment. I mean, it's kind of shocking now. You look at pictures of the Beatles to think that they were considered to have very long hair.
Yeah.
Because they certainly don't by any standards of today when they started, right? But
Yeah.
at the time, it was like shocking and revolutionary. And that's kind of, my brother's hair was longer than the Beatles were when they started, when he got off the plane. And it was kind of like, oh shit, like my brother is one of those, so I had to like change my opinion about that, because I think I wasn't that. I was sort of open to it and sort of not, at that point, bit of a square.
Yeah.
But he would play with me. He was 7 years older than me, but we played all these games together, and usually around sports in different ways. And he really stimulated my imagination and encouraged me, in that kind of way. And it made a big difference.
Well put, Louis. That's well put. Now, outside your immediate family,
I think a lot of different friends I had over the years.
well, like name one and what'd you get from
when
them?
I was formative, so I think I started to gain consciousness of this like around this same time, like when I was in 4th grade, when I was 9 years old. And I was kind of lucky that year. I changed schools, which was very terrifying. And there was a whole kind of population to this school that I had never encountered before, these kids. And so there was a kid in my 4th grade class who was he was very tall and good athlete. And he was the best. He was kind of like the coolest kid in the class. And he had this thing he did, I guess, where he made somebody his best friend for the year, and for some reason he picked me, much to my surprise. And I felt special, and I felt like I belonged, which usually I sort of felt more outside of things, sort of not. I wasn't a nerd, but I wasn't in with anybody either,
Yeah.
Too odd for that. And he really appreciated my imagination, and he would tell me that. Like we'd be playing something like with toy soldiers or something, and he'd want to watch me do that, And so I realized at that point consciously, I think, more that I was, that I had something that was a little bit out of the that was somewhat out of the ordinary, and that sort of could become an identity for me, and it did.
Very good. So James Joyce was the first projectionist in Dublin about 100 years ago. He basically checked out. He said, "This is stupid. Why should I go inside a building and see a movie of a tree when I can go outside and see a real tree?"
Mm-hmm.
Years later, Faulkner said, "Sometimes the best fiction is more true than journalism." Why do we have to recreate things in order to get them? Why do we have to go to a theatrical play of people acting out life? Why don't we just live life?
Well, that's a very realist understanding of things. That like why do we need to recreate things? And Joyce's comment about the tree, if he applied that to his own writing, why do I need to read a book? Then. So I think he answered that for himself. He just didn't like watching movies, it sounds like. So, which I do, why do we need that? I have no idea, but humans seem to be wired to recreate, their experiences and to report on them. And one of the things you're doing, I know I'm doing when I do that is I'm compressing things, I'm focusing it, I'm focusing the meanings so that it's, an experience on some level that's communicable. Now, there's a lot of openness in the way I do things in terms of montage and imagery, and the viewer kind of has to fill in a lot of stuff also. Like the viewer's part, the audience's part of this is also very significant. So
that was good, because it's anticipating a lot of what we're going into now, and the commonality word that you used earlier was good. A screenwriting teacher told me a great art or great film is when you can clearly see the intention of the maker. Kubrick says the opposite. Great art is when you can clearly not see the intention of the maker. What role does intention play in your creative process?
Well, it's definitely part of it. And having intention can be useful and it can be limiting. And depending on how well a particular piece I'm working on comes out.
Yeah.
So it's very specific to each piece. But intention is always there. And then I do think that in my experiences of exploring, because I do a lot of improv, what the unconscious does. The unconscious is kind of wired up with all kinds of predilections that maybe aren't examined always. They might, they emerge spontaneously. And when I'm going good, they're sort of smarter than I am. With intention or conscious intent. They do something more than that. When it's not going so well, they do less than that and just expose like kind of things that I've already absorbed that are not, that I'm not putting out in a more interesting way. So again, it depends on the piece, and it depends on how successful any of these things are.
Well, Duchamp said there's no art without an audience. How much are you thinking of your
what?
How much are you thinking of your viewer when you're making your film?
There's places where I'm thinking of the viewer. Yeah. But it depends. Again, it depends on the film. There's films I make where I don't think much about the viewer. I think about what I'm trying to express, describe, and I don't even know what I'm kind of after. Sometimes I'm aspiring to get to a place that's beyond language. Other times it's very specific. Like I have certain things in mind that I know, okay, this will hit in this kind of way, or maybe it'll hit, a moment will hit. Like I can tell it's a big moment, like within the structure of a piece or within the impact of a piece. So again, just things are very variable. And I don't like to take a position that's absolute about like, well, it all has to be improvisation. Well, it all has to have intent. Well, you have to think it all through in advance. It has to be all, I make things to discover sort of what I'm thinking, which goes back to a quote you gave early on,
Yeah. Well, the Balinese have no word for art. They do everything as well as they can. But it's actually Greenaway. Peter Greenaway said cinema is much too rich a medium to be left to storytellers. It's a stupid question, I know, but it's just a jumping off prompt. Are experimental filmmakers doing something completely different or telling stories a different way? If me and you watch The Flicker by Tony Conrad,
Yeah.
we could have stories go through our head,
Right.
but it's not really what we think is storytelling or narrative, though it's a disputable subject.
People always often confuse progression with narrative, and they're not the same thing. I find.
Please tell. That's what I was just going to add. Please tell me the difference, because Andrew Noren says, yeah, you put one frame after another, that is narrative. But if it's all abstract, is that storytelling? So yeah,
Yeah, I think, I guess, you know, things can be linear and not tell stories.
Yeah.
So Flickr is a good example on another level, because people are wired perceptually differently, and you can't predict how that's going to hit somebody, what that's going to do, in somebody's consciousness. Some people just don't see it at all, right? Other people are highly so sensitive to it that they can have an epileptic fit, right, if they're wired that way. So there's or get nauseous, or watching the Flicker, one of the great pleasures for me, because I had enough sensitivity, is that I had sensitivity the right way, is that when the Flicker increases speed, I started to hallucinate colors.
Yeah.
See, those colors would be different for me maybe than they would be for somebody else. Yep. Depending on how it's your perceptual wiring is highly individual this way. So the Flicker's a good one in that way. Storytelling, I find to be one of the things that most interests me in different ways. And so for me, with what I make, a lot of it, it's not all of it, but a lot of it is what you described about different ways to tell stories.
Yeah.
I could see that being true for Andrew Noren from the films of his I've seen,
Yeah.
But in classic filmmaking, classic Hollywood filmmaking, that's usually what's being rebelled against in a lot of people's models.
Yeah.
I think is actually much richer and much more sophisticated than anything that I've ever seen somebody like Peter Greenaway do.
Yeah.
And much more poetic, and has many more things inside it for me than the kinds of things that, and much more interest than the kinds of things that Peter Greenaway actually did. Hollis
Frampton has a quote in this regard too. Narrative is born among the animal necessities of the spirit because we're waiting to die. Can you forget to die?
I don't think death is about remembering or forgetting. It's about your, body and consciousness ceasing to function. It's not a matter of, it doesn't apply, I mean, there's a kind of death if you don't have memory, I think, in terms of personality, but that's not the same thing as your body. Your body can live without a brain. For a time, if it's taken care of, so it's can you forget to die? No, I would doubt it.
Well, Louis, what are the services and disservices of marginalizing experimental film? Jackson Pollock was on the cover of Life magazine in 1949. Yeah. Regular folks could start developing an aesthetic on experimental painting. There was no Bruce Conner or Maya Deren on Life magazine covers. Generally, it's privileged, entitled, I call them rich art kids, who develop an aesthetic for avant-garde film and dominate the experimental film world. Any comments?
Yeah, I never found it to be dominated by rich people at all. It's dominated by middle class people, I think, of all different stripes. But I think that's something people often don't like to talk about, is how middle class most art making is. That's where it evolves from. You know? But there's people of all classes doing these things. So it's not. But experimental film. Where the first generation comes from. It's not like it's Connor and Brackage and Darren. Like, I don't know much about Darren's background, but she was a dancer, right?
Yeah.
Before she's a filmmaker. And, a lot of people, once they're doing this stuff, they kind of become poor. So, almost all of them have had to teach. It's not a great field for having monetary success in. Like you.
Well, that's the subject we met on. I mean, we discussed. I said, "How'd you get your films into art gallery?" They're selling files in an art gallery. You go, "I didn't seek that out. They came to me," and I thought that was a great answer.
Yeah, no, that's a very practical answer.
Yeah, no, it was a beautiful answer,
which is that you used to be able to approach galleries about this. And I remember, like, when I was studying with Paul Sharitz at Buffalo, he was talking about he had some different opportunities, like, should he make a commercial for General Motors, because he was offered to do that. He had a lot of moral considerations about that, that he would discuss with the class I was in. But also, he had a gallery, which made total sense for what he was doing, I think, with visual art. Michael Snow, functioned in the gallery world. Frampton did too. And it's, but I never got very, except for a few things here and there, nothing ever happened. And when I would approach people, they would not listen. It was not possible. And in 2013, I had this big, end of 2013, early 2014, I had a big interview in Art Forum.
Yeah.
Well, I was lucky enough to that editors working there then valued my filmmaking and gave me this 8-page spread, and it was great. And I spoke to the photo editor. I mean, the editor of the section on film at the time, and asked him for advice about that. And he basically cued me in that you can't approach them.
Yeah.
That there was a time where you could go around with a portfolio, but that was over. That it's like either they approach you or that's it. Now you can get different shows to get noticed, and stuff. And people have done better with this kind of stuff. Usually they study, they get graduate degrees in art making, and that teaches them how to kind of interface with the gallery world. But I didn't do that. I never went to grad school. So when it happened for me from that spread, it was a person I had met who in England, named Jackie Davies, who was somebody who was a producer in of like different animations mostly. So that's how I got to know her. And she had done something where she got me a commission with the BBC to make a little piece on, and then she was involved with a very good gallery called the Anthony Reynolds Gallery, which had been in existence for decades. And she was working with Anthony, and she recommended, after she saw that spread, that they take me on, and that's how it came about. So it was like, okay, I got the attention in art form, which led to that, right?
Yeah.
Because they could see the printing of my images was strong enough. They could see that they could imagine some potential for me in terms of being able to sell photographs or collages or whatever. So, and I had a pretty good run with them. Made some money at times. They sold films, they sold photographs, but I never really took off. It didn't generate other shows. Yeah. And at this point, it's kind of like just another experience I had, like working in advertising, like working in Hollywood as a screenwriter. For me, the way things go is I kind of get a few years of these things and then I move on. Mostly I'm a teacher, and that's how I make it.
That's Phil Solomon, bless his heart. When he was alive, I asked him all these same questions, and he says, I'm a professional experimental filmmaker. I goes, yeah, right. You show at Sundance. So what? You still have to teach. Yeah. So it reminded me also of, Frank Morris made Frank film in 73 it was a success because he hooked up with a McLuhan guy called Tony Schwartz, who really molded the soundtrack. And in 73, won in Ann Arbor, and he won an Oscar.
Right.
And then the Rhoda TV show came to him and said, do the credit opening for us. And he goes, nope, I'm not going to sell out to Hollywood. And you look at it and it looks just like Frank film. Well, Frank film looks just like Stan Vanderbeek. And so it doesn't, it's that whole collage history that you've learned and utilized so well in your career, Harry Smith and all these greats. Vanderbeek and
was the first
Larry Jordan. Yeah. But I got to tell you, these two funny quotes that I love when we're talking about this is the guy who published the great punk magazine that spawned everybody, Matt Groening, everybody in LA. Flipside, Al said, don't sell out, sneak in. And then Paul Schrader said, the role of the artist is not to attempt to sell out. The role of the artist is to sell, but
I'm sorry.
So anyway,
can you repeat that? You were breaking up there. I lost you.
Yeah. The Schrader quote goes like this: the role of the artist is to attempt to sell out, but fail. So that romanticizes the whole thing. But a couple questions more about film. I talked to Michael Apted 40 years ago. I says, why do rock video editors feel so obliged to edit fast? Bruce Conner was showing up on MTV Devo videos. So it was a way to get experimental films into the mass public. And most people don't know Abel Gance invented rapid montage in 1922 in France. But in the 80s, it flourished to the point where Scorsese says, I cut my films faster because of MTV. So Michael Apted said, because we've learned to take in information faster. So Louis, my question is, asked with a bias, can we literally learn to take in information faster, or are we just brainwashed to believe we can?
Well, what's being talked about there is kind of like norms that one is used to in terms of viewing, and acceleration of speed. And you're right. Like these things go back to early film history. Like the Russians certainly were doing fast cut, montage. Um, and not just Abel Gance, but it's and Scorsese clearly owes a debt to Anger and Connor, and Scorsese's a person that lives seeped in media, so he's always was looking at things and getting inspiration from them for whatever he was doing. But in my own experience, I had a good experience of this. Actually, I saw Peter Kubelka, who made really fast cut films. Right?
Yep.
When I was first starting at the Museum of Modern Art, and he would talk about this of like, you need to speed up, you need to, and so some of it is just, and I've seen this teaching experimental film where some of it is just getting used to the way it delivers information. And one of the things that helped with that, which Kubelko was very, a big fan of, was multiple viewings of a piece, because obviously you see more. And that starts to slow things down. Now, I experienced this also as an editor, right? Editing my own work, of the way that like when I'm inside an editorial process, it expands, the knowledge of what's in one shot and what it's doing with the next, and what the cut does, and all these things, because I'm looking at it over and over and over again, right? To decide what the edit should be. And by doing that, there's a learning process, there's a memorization. So I made a film, in fact, that plays with this idea of memorization, and it's pretty fast. The second and third parts are pretty quick. It's a trilogy of films called the 2 Minutes to Zero trilogy. And the first film's about 22 minutes, and that's the slowest. And I'm shooting a comic book close up, and basically kind of describing, like, it's a crime film, describing a bank robbery and the main characters. And I'm doing these different kinds of alterations on the characters, like the main character, who I make a bank robber, is actually a hero in the comic book, and a good guy and a detective, but I make him a criminal. And there's different ways that I'm altering the imagery so that that's possible. And it's pretty quickly cut. And then the next one, so the first one is called 2 Days to Zero. It's about 22 minutes, 23 minutes long. The next one's called 2 Hours to Zero. That's 9 minutes. And then the last one, which kind of compresses everything you've seen in watching the 31 minutes before that, into 1 minute, right?
Yeah.
I actually made this one first, that one, by the time you get to that, you've memorized all this imagery from the other 31 minutes. And then you can see inside that. Whereas if you watch that film by itself, it wouldn't open up as much as if you watch the other two before it, right?
It seems like it's a training film, how to watch that rapid montage. But the hidden question really there, Louis, is it literally possible for humans to multitask?
Again, I think it's like perceptual wiring. I can't do it. I have one focus at a time. So I guess I could multitask if I just keep changing what I'm doing. I guess I've multitasked occasionally that way. I don't really like to do that. It's very, so yeah, you can multitask, but I don't, it's not like, I've never seen anybody be able to do two things at the same time, really.
Yeah.
They can stop doing something and do something else. So they're sort of alternating,
Yeah.
what they're doing. But I've never seen anybody do two things at once like that. I mean, I guess, well, people do in this sense of like, you're watching a TV show and you take a drink, right? Or you light a cigarette up and, you're doing both at the same time, right?
Yeah.
So, yeah, I mean, there's overlaps and it's very specific, I guess, in terms of what senses are being operated on, I guess. Would cause a multitask. So like, I can be shooting and I can be listening to music that's not the music I'm going to use for the film that I'm working on.
Yeah.
And I'm listening and I'm shooting, right? So I am multitasking by that definition, right?
Is perception reality?
Again, yes and no.
Yeah. Well, okay. One more film question. Well, we'll continue. How did you? What's the
philosophy, Jerry?
What's the roots of your framing aesthetic? What informs how you framed? What's the roots, or what informed how you frame things?
That's a good question. It's very intuitive, and it evolved intuitively. It wasn't like, I mean, I did study a lot of narrative film and look at them in terms of like composition. I spent years kind of doing that. So there's that part of it that helped. I have a kind of construction, and this is partly from working with cutouts and the kinds of limitations they have with the way I work with them, of tableaus, of like I make tableaus. And so I think that's what you're referring to. And I find that like kind of, inexhaustible in a way. But there's other times where it's more about sequencing, and the compositions are not very complicated, one way or another. But at first, I was more excited about like creating a tableau. I'm a big fan of mise en scène as part of composition, classic mise en scène. So, making tableaus is part of that. But working with cutouts, I wasn't really moving the camera so much. I was moving the compositions,
That was really articulate. I appreciate it, Louis, because I asked Bruce Bailey this question in Ann Arbor, and he says, well, I'll refer to Joan Cocteau. He says, I developed my framing aesthetic from the way they put the knife and fork down, setting the table at dinner.
That's beautiful.
I mean, it goes into a subject we could go into for hours, but
Bailey had such an extraordinary eye,
Yeah. And it's like this whole idea of the way people have learned to frame things is the history of photography and painting. Right. Told us how to frame things. So that goes to like
and film,
And film, exactly, and all that. And so then when you hear about that Alice Guy Blanchet, her film influenced Eisenstein when he was 8 years old, then where does the male gaze change, and there's the female gaze or the male gaze, or is there just the human gaze? So I don't know if you've seen Nina Menken's film Brainwash, but I mean, that's another salon I would like to do with you and several other people, is the whole thing about the human gaze. But I'm curious, what do you think the motive of the cave artist was?
I have no idea. I don't know enough about cave artists to know,
But I mean, your hunch, do you think it's really changed why you create art and why people created art that many years ago?
It looks, the little bit I know about it, it looks, superficially, it looks the same to me.
Yeah.
Of why they're doing things. On some regards, of like, people like to make records of things, and so there's that aspect to it. But I don't, who knows why they were doing what they were doing. It's like I haven't spent any time with that, so with cave paintings, just very superficially. So it's not a source for me to think about that. The other aspect, though, of tableau that maybe relates a little bit to some of these things we're talking about is cutouts for me are very like hieroglyphic.
Yeah.
So to some degree, I'm one of my impulses is to kind of use images to almost write text with. And so that's a different way of working, than
no, it's amazing because you started as a writer. That's what I learned from you. You started as a writer. Mm-hmm. And McLuhan has an interesting philosophy. He says, everything we invent extends some humanness. So knife and fork extend our teeth, clothing extends our skin, maybe even non-tangible philosophy or religion extends consciousness. What do the scissors extend for you? What humanness? Because I mean, that's one of your main tools, because it's the same with me. I've been a collage artist since I, saw Max Ernst wonderful collages. Like, wow, all you got to do is cut the stuff out. What collage reminds me of, again, we could do a whole salon on collages. Duchamp's great line, the artist of the future will only have to point. So it's like, yeah, there's my, I want that image. So just in this idea, what humanness do the scissors extend for you?
Well, I guess it would be, because they're about cutting, be about teeth, right?
Teeth. Right. Yeah.
And also might be about nails, because you could use nails to cut with too. Fingernails.
Nails. You mean like your fingernails?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's good. I spoke with a painter recently. I says, what does your paintbrush extend? And I think it was a woman. She said, my nails. And you think maybe a finger extends the paintbrush. But it's even the poet. The poet said, what the writing utensil extends. He said, my tears. So we got about 10 more minutes. This has really been fun. And George Manupelli said, ignore yourself. Jonas Mikas said, there is no self-expression. Cecil Taylor, great jazz pianist, says, I'm just a vehicle and this stuff just comes through me. Again, I know it's both and it depends. It's a stupid question, but is art making more self-expression or more you're a vehicle for whatever technologies, cultures, and environments are dominant?
Well, one thing I'm going to say is I've never met a more disingenuous person about their ego than Jonas Mikas. you know, constantly claiming to be interested in the small, and I never got more of a star fucker than that guy was. But
Thanks for
the
being
you know, so I found him to be totally a hypocrite on so many
Yeah.
levels. Meeting him, so I would disregard what he would have to say about that.
But it's more like Cecil saying you're a vehicle, you know,
yeah, and Cecil Taylor, I mean, I have a great memory of seeing him when I was a teenager, because I hung out with all these friends who were jazz musicians in high school and in early college. And I saw him like on 8th Street in the East Village. And it was an extraordinary, it's an extraordinary memory of, he just came out and played at this incredible speed, faster than any punk I've ever seen, you know, any punk music. And he did that for like an hour, you know, over an hour. And then when he was done, he slunk away from the piano and went off stage. And he looked like a ghost, you know, he looked like he wasn't there. You know, he was so exhausted and so drained. So yeah, I guess like things really were pouring through him. You know, now it was very radical music. It's not something I've like gone back to much or want to listen to very often, you know, but what an experience that was live. It's not my take, you know, like I kind of like more melody than that in what I listen to on a regular basis, but what an experience. But I think again, these things, you know, you can't really generalize.
Yeah.
And it's just like, yeah, I could see how that would be totally true for him. For me, like, yeah, things come through me and they're often better than the things I can think up. And that's great. You know, improvisation is part of what I do, but it's also, you know, there's times where I'm very consciously trying to do things, you know, and it's, one of the things I like about collage is the way that it's part of me and it's all these things that I'm collaborating with that I didn't make, that I've chosen to work with. And that to me describes a lot of the interaction in the world of like, you have control over some things, you don't have control over all kinds of other things, you know, and it's a shared kind of collaborative experience this way. Now, one of the things that's funny in collage is like, you know, or odd or off. I'm talking about this as collaboration usually because I'm often trying to honor what I'm working with, but in another way, I'm not asking for permission. You know, a lot of the authors of the things that I made are dead, so I couldn't ask for permission. I don't have the money to acquire permission, you know, and so the you know, the idea that this is collaboration is something you could, you know, poke with a stick, you know, and get angry hornets to come after you, you know.
That's
it's like, you know, there's a way me saying that's completely disingenuous, you know.
That's like snakes in your mailbox. I asked Alexis Smith this. She goes, "I got good lawyers," but it's really, you brought up evoked two great quotes. When I worked for George Carlin, we got a flyer in the mail and says, "I'm trying to get more control over my spontaneity." But it was really, I was curious if you read much Joyce, because you read a lot of classics, or you read literature. You come out of
No, I haven't read that many classics. You know, I'm a very slow reader, so I've read certain things that have had, like whatever I've read, certain things have had big impact on me. But like, for instance, Flaubert's Sentimental Education, I try to reread that every like 10 years. I first read that when I was like 19. And it keeps changing and it keeps telling me things. But I read Joyce when I was early college. I read the Dubliners, maybe in high school too. I don't know. That's when I read that stuff. And I'm not a Joyce fan. He doesn't do it for me.
Well, here's the question. Here's the question, Louis, because you got to read Finnegan's Wake out loud with a group of people in order to get it. So it's a completely different experience than what we are used to in reading. We think it's a one-on-one between the author and you. But with this, it's like a hootenanny, and you read out loud with a group of people. And McLuhan basically broke the Finnegan's Wake code. He got everything he knows from Finnegan's Wake. And it's basically something you've talked about. It's that artist's dream awake. And it's not to sound elitist. Everyone has this power to create these scenarios in the middle of the night, but artists can also dream while they're awake. And the question is, have dreams affected your creative process, like consciously? Do you utilize them?
I think more than dreams. Yeah, I mean, there's been times where they've influenced things I'm doing. But more, okay, I'll tell you some different stories here. Okay. A few years ago, I was going through old, when I was like in my early 20s, I would keep journals and stuff. And so one I found was like a dream journal from, I don't know, like half a year, maybe a year, and I read them. I reread the whole thing, and I thought, what a fucking bore this is. And I don't want anybody else to read this ever. And I destroyed it. But it was just like really boring. I could sort of read into each dream. I could remember things that were painful to me, that the dreams were like symbolizing, and it was a period like I just didn't want to remember, in this way. It was very painful, and I was very confused and looking. It was before I was into or at the beginning of when I was into filmmaking. Just had found some of this, but so there's that aspect. But I think, dreaming awake, what's been much more for me than I have dreams that I remember from when I'm very little. So there's places where there's significant dreams that happen, right? Occasionally, I've tried to render some of those, but very occasionally. But more what I've always done since I was a little boy is kind of be in a reverie that's a kind of storytelling reverie.
Yeah.
And so this idea of dreaming awake, which I didn't coin, as a description of my work, the wonderful curator, critic, scholar, Chris Stoltz did. He described my work that way, and I thought, wow, that's great. That really does get at it, of like this idea of dreaming awake, and it's this kind of reverie one goes into. But I think you kind of go into that reverie watching a movie, or watching TV or listening to music, or and so that's really where I've spent my time. Sometimes I think like, wow, I've spent a lot of time in my life just like cutting up pictures, floating on music, shooting, like doing these to make what I make, and it's kind of like sometimes I think about it and I think, wow, what an odd life, in that way. So much of my waking life was spent just in this kind of trying to be in this kind of like reverie.
That's cool. That's cool. It reminds me of like Joseph Cornell or somebody like that. Yeah, yeah. They live. I saw that great little doc on you, how you collect your piles of stuff. Thank God you got a wife who's understanding about collecting shit. Like
she's as bad as I am.
Well, I wouldn't use the word bad. I would use it. You're both you're archivalists. And that's another salon I'd love to do.
No, I can't. No, we're not archivalists, because archivalists. I did an interview with my friend Jeffrey Scholar, and he was asking me about.
I know him. Yeah,
I know. Great guy. Very smart. And he said, what's your relationship to archive? And I said, the exact opposite of what an archive does. I'm not an archivist. Like I buy everything of what I'm buying for use value. I buy it to destroy it. Archives, they take it to keep it, to preserve it. That's not what I do. I mean, there's some things I own that I wouldn't destroy because they're kind of old and precious. And when I teach collage, I give that as a prompt to the students sometimes of like, use something that you don't want to use, and see what they do then. Like whether they get around it by copying it in some kind of way, or they actually destroy this thing that they care about that they didn't want to use. It's an interesting kind of challenge.
Yeah, actually, I appreciate you making the distinction. It's that I'd like to do a salon on you with you and others where we talk about archiving and the art of collage and how there is crossover because it's accumulating and it's
collecting. There's collecting. Yeah.
But I asked for 90. We're over 90. Can you go some more, or you got to go?
No, I don't have to go.
Okay. So what's one major element, Louis, of your creativeness that's changed, and one major element that stayed the same since you started doing this?
Oh boy, that's a tough question, Jerry. I need a moment to think about that, because that's what's changed and what stayed the same. So I think like what I was just talking about, that stayed the same, right?
That stayed the same.
To me being a little boy, right?
Yeah.
When I was a little boy, I remember this with these friends. I would have these narratives pulsing through my head so strongly, and I would say to my best friend, I would say, "Now you say this." So I started reading the script in real time with him. My friend Joey again that I talked about earlier, and then he would say it, and then I would have my line, and then I'd tell him what to say next. I don't know why he put up with me. But it was like I had to play out this story that was in my head, so and we're playing with toy soldiers, and so that's something that's kind of stayed the same, that ability to project into objects in this kind of way. From when I was a little kid, I never lost that. And what's changed? Well, a lot has changed. A lot keeps changing. So I'll give you a specific example. Like, when I was a film student, and like brackage was very important when I was an experimental film student. So there was this idea kind of about music, partly from brackage, of like, you shouldn't use it, and it was a crutch. It was all these kinds of things. which is actually true when you're, a student. I don't let my students in my film class use music because I wanted them to develop other muscles, until the end of the class. Then I let them do it if they want. But then once I wasn't a student anymore, there was just this idea that Connor and Anger used music, right?
Yeah.
You couldn't do it as well as them. And so you couldn't, there was a kind of taboo against it,
Yeah.
And I found, so I was kind of like battling within myself about that. At a certain point, I just decided, well, to hell with that. I thought my work isn't that important and it's not going to survive. It's not very significant at all. And this sounds too much like the Christian, like a version of the Christian afterlife or something. You're going to go to art heaven because you showed all this restraint. And I realized what I really wanted to be doing was using music. And I started to. And I've done that. It sort of took over what I was doing more and more. I resisted it, for a long time. It wasn't the only thing I wanted to do. But it became like a dominant way that I worked. And now it's not that it's still not a big part of how I work. But I'm starting to feel like something else is evolving that's not music dependent, not music centric, not dependent, but music centric, that I'm getting more excited about, and so I'm interested to see where that's going to go. So that's a good example of many, many changes.
That's good.
Of the way things keep shifting. And maybe that's a good place for us to end.
Oh, wait a minute.
I'm cutting you short. Okay.
Yeah, give me some sort of can we have 10 more minutes or 5 more minutes?
Yeah, whatever you want. I can do it.
No, because I got a few more that I was really hoping to get to.
Okay. All right.
But that was really well put. Moshe Feldenkrais works with healing and movement. He says it's literally possible.
Who?
His name is Moshe Feldenkrais. It's a funny name, but he works with healing and movement. Mm-hmm. And he says it's literally possible to identify a weakness and incorporate it to become a strength, rather than we're normally taught to overcome a weakness. Tell me a weakness you turned into a strength.
Oh, well, that's easy with what I do, because I've always used a lot of things that are considered mistakes as expressive possibilities. Like when I started with cutouts, I taught myself how to do it. I didn't have a teacher, Yeah. And so my friend, the scholar critic Fred Camper, came over.
Yeah.
And he looked at what I was doing and he said, "Oh, I see you're not using glass," which was rather patronizing the way he was putting it. And he explained to me what glass was supposed to do, that you were supposed to use glass to hold the cutouts down so you wouldn't get shadows, right? Yeah. And this is the way it was taught. Actually, when I Larry Jordan's class, he talked about this, and that I seem to be working with it successfully in my work. This thing that he had taught them, that they shouldn't use shadows, that they avoid shadows. and there's times where you want to be selective about your shadows, where you don't want them, right?
Yeah.
When I started, I wasn't being selective or anything. I just didn't know any better. But I thought from Fred's comment, I got a little rebellious, but also I thought well, that seems really stupid, because shadows are some of the most interesting lighting effects in every other kind of film I've ever seen. So why wouldn't they be interesting here? So then I start to work with them consciously. So Fred did me a great favor by pointing that out to me, and I did start to use it consciously, and I grew, and I had broken this rule. Now I saw all kinds of films that had made before I started to do this, like Robert Nelson has a cutout film where he uses shadow, but nobody really worked with it in this very conscious way that I did, until I was doing it,
Good example, Louis, because Jean Cocteau says your first piece of art, when your friends or family or teacher criticizes it, take that criticism and exploit it for the rest of your career.
Well, I have done
okay, couple more and we're out of here. How do you find peace of mind?
Oh, I don't think I do. It sort of, like most things, it comes and goes. Okay, so here I'll tell you, this is probably the greatest moment in my life in terms of peace of mind. Okay.
Yeah.
So after college, I'm living in New York City. I became a New York City cab driver 3 days a week. And it's still like the hardest job I've ever done in my life, like physically, etc. And, I realized doing it, like, what a bad driver I actually was until I started driving a cab. And I learned how to drive well from that. Most of the time, not all the time, but most of the time. So one day I'm driving and I have a fare and I'm going down 2nd Avenue, going south on 2nd Avenue, a long way. And the traffic is backed up, basically. And something sort of came over me that, wow, if I could make art out of this, I might really have accomplished something as an artist. Whatever lane I chose to turn into moved. And I just drove through this backed up traffic. And this lasted about 40, 45 minutes. I had 3 different fares. Every one of them said to me, you're an amazing driver, without me saying anything,
Right. And
while I was doing this, it was kind of like, Jesus, what is going on? Like, what, but it was like, it must be like similar to these things that happen to great athletes, where they can
get in the zone.
Perform, they get in the zone.
Yeah.
This was the best feeling I think I've ever had in my life.
That is
strangely like driving a cab, not making art, not sex, not love, not success, driving a cab for 40 minutes, being in that zone. It's like, wow, if I could be like that.
It sounds like an epiphany. Tony Williams, great jazz drummer, played with Miles as a teenager. He says, if I could live my life as well as I play drums, I'd be well off. If you were walking down the street today and you met yourself as a 12-year-old, what would you say to your 12-year-old self?
Become a narrative filmmaker. Keep writing.
Yeah, thank God. Okay. Say it again.
Don't bother with film. Keep writing.
Yeah, keep writing. Thornton Wilder, there's a great writer, playwright. He said in 1928, art is confession. Art is the secret told. But art is not only the desire to tell one's secret, it's the desire to tell it and hide it at the same time.
Well, that's apropos to my expression. Like,
Yeah.
they're very personal, what I do. Often I am including things, and you can't decipher what it is I'm including. So well, let's talk about Fred Camper again. He wrote about a film of mine called The Pharaoh's Belt, which is one of the longer continuous films I've ever made. So about my childhood, and there's an image in that where a mother figure vacuums a figure of Moses holding the Ten Commandments into the vacuum. Now, he understood that image as being the horror of the suburbs and its sanitizing effect. And I thought, wow, that's like, number one, like, that's a really boring and superficial critique of the suburbs. The suburbs are much more complicated than that. And that's not what I was describing. In fact, what I was describing personally, and there's no way for somebody to understand this. I mean, Fred's interpretation is actually probably the way most people would understand that image. But what I was describing was my mother saving me from going to Hebrew school.
Oh my God.
And I would fake headaches to get out of it, and that's what, I could say, like, Mom, my head kind of hurts today. And she'd go, don't go to Hebrew school then.
That's Cheech and Chong. Earache my eye. No, it's actually Lewis. There's a great McLuhan joke. The man is complaining, or how do you say it? The man or the male is complaining. I don't want to go to school today, and the mother says, "You've got to go to school," and he goes, "I don't want to go," and the mother goes, "You're the principal. You got to go."
Yeah, it's funny. It's ironic because like now I'm a teacher and I love being a teacher because it's like all this shit I do in my head has some application to other people who are learning how to be artists, right? Well, which shocks me that it has any value whatsoever.
Well, you're still in that childhood freedom. You still have that childhood innocence. There's another joke that goes along perfectly. The kid gets to the age where they realize that the parent goes to work and has a job and makes money. So whatever, it's 5 or 6. Yeah. And he says, "Dad, what do you do for a living?" And his dad is an art teacher. He goes, "What do you do for a living?" He says, "I teach people how to draw." And the kid goes, "You mean they forgot?"
That's great. That's a great one.
But what you were saying about that, I think if this word is proper, you tell me, because the great subgenius McLuhan archivist Robert Dobbs says ambiguity is the sign of human maturity. But would you say that world when you're because you call it elliptical narrative?
I lost you. Repeat the lead up to the elliptical narrative.
Yeah, the ambiguous. I call it ambiguous, but it could be what you describe as elliptical narrative, because is it similar to this? Because when my study of literature taught me through McLuhan and Joyce that Edgar Allan Poe invented reasoning backwards. That's effects precede causes. That means he invented the detective novel. I'm only going to give you so much information so that you go, "Oh, I know what's behind that door," and you involve the reader. So then Poe spawned the symbolist. Mallarmé says, "Don't paint the thing itself, paint the effect it produces." Is that similar to elliptical narrative?
Well, I can tell you the origin story for me of elliptical narrative if you want.
Please do. Yeah, because I looked it up, and it basically claims in Wikipedia that Hemingway's doing it in 23, and then Virginia Woolf's doing it in 27. So yeah, tell me your origin.
Yeah, I don't claim to have invented it. I'll tell you a funny story first about using the term. So I was in the Whitney Biennial, like sometime in the aughts, I forget when, like 2004 or 6 or something. And so I'm dealing with description. Actually, the film I described before, the 2 Minutes to Zero trilogy was in there, right? The 3 films. And so I described it as an elliptical narrative. And the curatorial assistant to Chrissy Isles, the main curator, calls me up and says, well, what is this term you're using? Is it and like, you can't just, say that, like that you have. And I was kind of like, they had a totally different take on it. They weren't seeing any narrative in it at all.
Yeah.
Which was fascinating to me. They were seeing it as an experience of different qualities of paper, because I was shooting this comic book up close, which I thought, well, I love that as an interpretation too. But no, there's very, it's very specifically narrative, this thing, and it's elliptical. And so I was in this discussion with her, and she was disputing that I should use it. And I'm thinking, well, even if I made up this term, why wouldn't you want to use it? It's a brilliant term, but
it sounds good.
Or, like, I didn't make this term up. And she, by then computers were part of everything, and she looked it up, and she eventually gave in. She said, okay. I see what you're saying. I mean, I looked it up, and it is a real term,
Yeah.
But to me, it was just kind of like, hey, artists coin things all the time. If you think I made this up, like, why don't you want to use that? Like it's just like they were trying to get it out of my writing that they were printing in the catalog or whatever it was, So, so that was strange. But the way I happened upon it, because I really wanted to do narrative filmmaking, but I didn't really. I sort of studied that in a half-assed kind of way, right? And I didn't study making it, And so I've always been interested in being more and more narrative in different ways, and there's different opacities is the word I used to use that I like to use about the clarity of whatever narrative that I'm doing that relates to the ellipticalness, right? And so I made this film that was a film noir. Again, same period as the story I told you about Fred Camper with the shadows. And he actually figures in this one too. So this is great. And I showed it. I finished this thing that was a noir. I did my version of a noir. It's called In the Month of Crickets, part of my series, Tales of the Forgotten Future, first part. It's a series of trilogies, like 4 trilogies. And this was the 3rd film. And all the other 2 films, all of them were in black and white and Super 8. And I was telling myself a story that I thought was clear, right?
Yeah.
So then I would test screen my work.
Wow.
On different people. And the main person, of course, was Tom Gunning, who was my mentor. And my films wouldn't be what they are, anywhere near what they are, I think, if I hadn't been fortunate enough to encounter him and have a dialogue with him. he actually introduced me to Fred. So in a way, they were like sort of my graduate school that I never attended, my unofficial graduate school. But so he was over at my Avenue B little hovel of an apartment, and Fred Camper was there. And I showed them this film. And they said that it made them paranoid. Because for them, one of the things that they prided themselves on was an ability to read narrative. And as film scholars, and it made them anxious. Actually, I don't think Fred was there. Actually, it was David. It was David James. I showed this to at another point, and he said the same thing that Tom said, that it made him paranoid. And they couldn't read it, and they realized that it was functioning in this other kind of way. Now, for me, making it was totally clear. Like, I could take you through it and I could go, like, this is happening now. This is happening now, and it would be fascinating to show to these different people. I remember, like, there was this one moment where there's all this flicker, and I had showed it to Paul Arthur, and he said, well, when the bomb goes off, and it's this little like, no, they're just driving in a car there, is in my version of it, right? But for him, a bomb went off, and it was just like, that's a good reading. And so I had this decision I had to make about, like, if I wanted the narrative I was telling to be totally clear, then I would have to go back to the drawing board and revise the film. But I was very happy with the film. And I realized that I could accept that, right? And one of the things I thought about it is, it seems to me what all these people are getting out of and reporting to me about how they're understanding this film is far more interesting than what I thought I was telling as a narrative. And it's also more complicated. It's more complex what they're bringing to it than what I was probably thinking about too, in a lot of ways. So at that point, I started to really embrace, that was the moment where I consciously embraced this idea of elliptical narrative, and that was one of the qualities of it, was that it's sort of like, it's readable enough that you can make assumptions about it and think that you're reading it on some level. And then it's also smudged and not available enough that it's open to different kinds of interpretation. And so my decisions had to change about what I considered to be successful, or my standards had to change then. What I considered to be successful or not, moving forward,
that
working that way,
that really was articulate. It really, you explained it well to me, because McLuhan updated medium is the medium is the massage, or the medium is the message, mid-career to the user is the content. So the artist, once the artist creates their art, it's no longer theirs. The user can use it however they want. And if you
I would disagree with that too. Like there's enough there, but it's an interpenetration between the two. Is right. What, but it's like sometimes people tell me their interpretations, and it's just like, well, that's fine. That's what you did with it. That's not at all what I did, though. As far as I'm concerned, and it doesn't mean just because it's their interpretation that it interests me either.
Right, that it interests you. I'm not trying to,
or that I think it's accurate.
Like, but I'm not asking for
there's
accuracy.
A kind of like a bothness that it needs to. It's both what's in them, but also enough of what's on the screen.
It's sort of like the social way you introduce a film. We've got Lewis here tonight, and he'll ask a Q&A afterwards. And,
Right.
do you want to make an opening statement? And you go, I hope you enjoy my film. It's like, don't tell me to, I'm not saying you do this, but it's the social norm. Don't tell me to enjoy your film. Tell me, I hope it affects you, but that's not the norm way we say this. And I'm so glad you brought up all these people, because I actually asked all these same questions to Fred Camper, and Tom Gunning is the person of all the people I've ever interviewed who's gotten the most hits ever. And he is truly amazing. But David James will not say yes to an interview. So I really thank you for doing this. We could go on forever and ever, but why don't we close out now, Lewis, with this question? What there's one more thing I want to reflect on what you said. It's interesting that you say, as a 12-year-old, you would say, be a narrative filmmaker, when you had this epiphany when you did this test screening, because I've studied the whole history of test screening too. Harold Lloyd invented in 1928, and it's like homogenizing art, but in a way you don't want to homogenize your art, but it gave you some feedback from people you respected, like Fred Camper and David James and Tom Gunning. And
I showed it to other people that I realized, oh, this is their perspective. That's not useful to me. And I'm not going to show them anything in progress again, because they're not helpful to me,
So in closing, what gives you the most optimism?
Oh boy. What gives me the most optimism? I think it's where I see people change in ways that surprise them for the better.
Yeah.
Good
word.
I think that I find that very moving. When I read stories like that about people that they question different things and become more open and more loving in the world.
I agree with you completely. You used a lot of great words there. Surprise, more, getting better, in questions and love. That's what this series is all about, in fact, because the first question is, what is the best thing for a human being? Wilhelm Reich said the best thing for a human being is another human being. In the last question I got from the question they asked Groucho Marx at the end of his life, what gives you the most optimism? And he said, other people. So it's really amazing sharing this time with another person. I appreciate your conversation, Lewis, and your time and energy. And I appreciate what you do with your art, and that you have the courage to do your art. So thank you so much.
Well, I appreciate the interview, Jerry. I know I was like David James and wouldn't agree to do it for a very long time, but thanks for being persistent, and I really enjoyed myself, and it's great to talk to you.
Thank you so much. Even though I'm going to hit the end broadcast button, I hope our conversation will never end and we can go on talking forever and ever.
Okay, well, I look forward to the next time we talk.
All right. Thanks a lot, Lewis.